It's the summer of 1942, inside a covered graving dock on Tokyo Bay. Under a roof of matting and netting in the half-light stands a hull as vast as any warship ever laid down. It is the third battleship of the Yamato-class, roughly half-built, her riveted steel rising in the dark where no aerial camera can find her. Then the news reaches Yokosuka. At Midway, in a single day, Japan has lost 4 aircraft carriers, and the order comes down to the men in the dock. Stop! Cut her open. Finish her not as a battleship, but as a carrier. Think for a moment about what they are being asked to do. A warship hull as big as any in the world, laid down as one kind of ship, to be reborn as another, in total secrecy, against a clock that will not stop. Rebuilding her would save her from the scrappers. It would also follow her to sea. So this is where we begin. Not with the torpedoes every other account races toward, but with the machines that built the Shinano. The graving dock dug and roofed to swallow a leviathan and hide her from the sky. The riveted hull and the armor she was designed to carry. The redesign that turned a battleship into a carrier. The battleship power plant driving her 4 great shafts. And the unfinished ship that slipped out to sea at last with her most vital work still undone. 2 ships and 1 hull, and the machines that made them both. Before there was a ship, there had to be a place to build her. And the first machine that built the Shinano was not a crane or a rivet gun, it was the dock. At Yokosuka Naval Arsenal on Tokyo Bay, the Navy had cut a single graving dock into the ground and lined it with concrete and stone. They numbered it 6. Yokosuka had other docks, and most of them were built for repair, a place for a wounded ship to be pumped dry, patched, and sent back to sea. Dry dock number 6 was different. It had been dug for one purpose, to build, and not to build just anything. It was shaped and sized for the largest warships the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever lay down, the Yamato-class, the heaviest battleships in the world. A graving dock is a simple idea carried out on a monstrous scale. It is a basin cut into the shore below the level of the sea, sealed at the open end by a great floating gate. Flood the basin and a hull can be moved on the water. Pump it dry and the ship settles onto a floor of wooden blocks, and the men can walk the full length of her keel on dry ground under the open sky, with the sea held back behind the gate. Every inch of her, above the waterline and below it, is theirs to reach. Number 6 was one of the largest such basins on Earth. 67.5 meters wide, 17 meters deep, long enough to cradle the largest warship then afloat with steel to spare at either end. Stand at the bottom of it dry and the walls climb above you like the sides of a canyon. Into that canyon the Navy meant to raise the largest warship it would ever build. And then they hid it. Here's the part that has no equal anywhere else in shipbuilding. The Shinano was not merely built in secret. She was built inside a structure designed to defeat the human eye and the aerial camera at once. Yokosuka was no hidden inlet. It was one of the Navy's great arsenals, busy and long established, sitting open to view in plain sight on Tokyo Bay. To raise the Navy's greatest secret in a place like that, the yard could not simply post guards at a gate. It had to make the ship disappear where she stood. So a tall fence went up on 3 sides of the dock, screening the work from the ground. Over the dock itself, the arsenal raised a roof. Not a roof of iron, which would have announced its purpose to any pilot passing overhead, but a canopy of sisal matting and camouflage netting strung across the basin so that from the air the largest construction site in Japan would read as open ground. The ship grew in a permanent twilight under a ceiling of woven fiber and net, lit by work lamps hidden from the sky. The men were sealed in with her. The workforce that built the Shinano did not go home at night. They lived inside the compound, behind the fence, in the closed world of the dock. What they saw there they were forbidden to speak of anywhere else. Watching over them stood the Kempeitai, the secret military police, whose trade was the enforcement of silence, and who treated a careless word about the ship and the dock as a crime against the state. And so we can say something about her that is almost impossible to say about a warship of her size. Of the Shinano under construction, there exists no official photograph. None was ever taken. The largest thing the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever put into the water rose from the floor of dry dock number 6 without a single sanctioned image being made of her. She is the only major warship built anywhere in the 20th century of which that is true. Every other great ship of the age left a trail of photographs behind it, launch day crowds, proud portraits at the yard. The Shinano left almost nothing. She was assembled behind a wall of fiber and netting and armed guards, and the wall held. That was the machinery of hiding: a basin, a gate, a fence, a roof of matting, and a police force. But hiding a ship is not the same as building one. Behind the fence, beneath the netting, down on the blocks at the bottom of that concrete canyon, something enormous had already been standing in the dark for a long time. It was not a carrier. It was not finished. It was a battleship, riveted steel rising plate by plate toward a shape the world would never be permitted to see. To understand what the order after Midway would tear open, we first have to look at what was already standing in the dock. Because before the order came, she was not a carrier at all. She was a battleship. She was the third of her line. The Imperial Japanese Navy had already laid down two giants, the heaviest battleships the world would ever see. This was to be the third, laid down on the 4th of May 1940, on the blocks at the bottom of dry dock number 6. For 2 years she had been growing there in the twilight under the netting, and what was growing was a Yamato-class hull, plate by plate, rivet by rivet. And that last word matters more than it sounds. Rivet. Because this is where the Shinano Parts Company, with almost every great warship rising in the West at the same moment. By 1940, the shipyards of Britain and America were turning more and more to the welding torch, fusing plate to plate in a single molten seam. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not follow them. Its capital ships were riveted throughout the hull from the keel up. Every plate of that vast body was joined to the next by driven iron, heated white, hammered home, and left to clench cold. Picture the scale of that on a hull the size of a Yamato. The class swallowed more than 6 million rivets. That is the figure for the class, for these great hulls as a type, and it is a number the mind can barely hold. Not welds, rivets. Every single one heated in a portable forge until it glowed, carried to the plate, driven through a punched hole, and hammered flat while a second man braced the head from the far side of the steel. Then, as the iron cooled, it shrank, and in shrinking it dragged the plates together tighter than any clamp could hold them. 6 million times. Think about what one of those rivets actually cost in labor, and then multiply. A man tended the forge and pulled the iron out white hot. Another caught it and set it in the hole before it lost its heat. A third held it fast from behind, while a fourth drove the exposed end down into a solid head, hammer blow after hammer blow, or leaned a heavy pneumatic gun against it and let the tool do the pounding. 4 sets of hands, 1 rivet, a handful of seconds, and then the whole gang moved along the plate and began again. Now stretch that across a body more than 800 feet long, up the sides, along the keel, deck by deck, in the permanent dust beneath the canopy, for year upon year. This was not a clean age of automated seams. It was heat and iron and muscle, repeated far past the point where any man could keep count, and it went on until a battleship stood where an empty floor had been. The steel itself was chosen with the same care. The main structure that ran the length of her, the great fore and aft spine that carried the ship's own weight and the strain of the sea, was built of high-tensile dual-hull steel, stronger stock for the places that took the hardest load. The rest of the hull was mild steel, a body graded plate by plate to where the punishment would fall. Onto that riveted hull went the armor, and here too the Shinano carried something particular. Along her waterline, abreast the magazines where the shells and the powder were stored, she was designed to wear a belt of steel 400 millimeters thick. More than 15 inches of hardened plate standing between the open sea and the most vital spaces in the ship. But her belt was thinner than her sister's, and thinner on purpose. When the Navy tested the armor of the first 2 ships of the class, the plate proved tougher than the calculations had promised. It was stopping more than it had been built to stop. So on this third hull, the designers pared the belt back, 10 to 20 millimeters thinner abreast the magazines, trusting the proven strength of the steel rather than carrying weight the ship did not need. It was a small economy on an enormous body. It was also a sign of how far the design had matured by the time she was begun. She was not the first of her kind, learning as she rose. She was the third, refined. And this was the ship that stood in dry dock number 6 in the early summer of 1942. Not a finished thing. A hull risen from the blocks, her riveted plates climbing toward the shape of a battleship, her machinery going in below, her armor plan drawn and set and waiting for the plate. By about June of that year, she stood roughly 45% complete as a battleship. Nearly half a Yamato, hidden in the dark, growing toward a future everyone in the dock believed they already knew. Then 4,000 miles away in the Central Pacific, 4 Japanese carriers burned and went under in a single day. And in that moment, everything about the half-built ship standing in the dock began to change. The order to cut her open came down in a single sentence. Turning that sentence into steel took the better part of a year. An order like that is simple to give and brutal to draw. The Navy's constructors were not handed an empty floor to design on. They were handed a hull already standing in the dock, most of a battleship, and told to decide what of it to keep and what to tear away. The answer they reached is the strangest thing about the whole conversion, and it is the key to everything that came after. They kept the ship, or rather they kept half of it. Below the waterline, Shinano barely changed at all. The riveted hull she had been growing for 2 years in the dark stayed exactly where it was. The belt of hardened plate along her side stayed bolted where it had always been meant to go. Everything down in the deep of her, the part that met the sea, was still a battleship, built to a battleship's plans and wrapped in a battleship's armor. It was only above the waterline that she was made into something else. And that is the thing to hold on to for the rest of this story. 2 ships in one hull, a battleship from the keel to the waterline, and a carrier from the waterline up, riveted and welded into a single body that had never been designed to be either one alone. The design was approved in July of 1942, only weeks after the 4 carriers burned in the Pacific. The detailed blueprints followed that November. And the men redrawing her did not invent her new shape out of nothing. Japan was already building a different kind of ship, an armored aircraft carrier named Taiho, and the constructors took Taiho as their pattern and scaled it up onto the far larger hull they already had standing in the dock. They took the drawings of the smaller ship and stretched them over the bones of the biggest thing in the yard. Then the grafting began, on paper first and in steel after. Everything above the waterline that had made her a battleship was cut down. The plans for her great gun turrets, for the towering armored citadel that would have carried her admiral and his rangefinders high above the sea, all of it came off the hull and off the drawing board. A ship designed as a gun platform had to be reimagined as something that carried nothing but aircraft. And that is not a small change. It moves the weight, it moves the balance, it hollows out the middle of the ship where the heaviest armor once stood. In place of the guns in the tower, the shipwrights raised a hangar, a vast enclosed deck the length of the ship to hold and arm her planes, and over that hangar they laid the flight deck they would launch them from. Onto the body of a battleship they grafted a carrier, and here the conversion did something on a scale no other carrier could match. They armored the flight deck itself, and armored it more heavily than anyone had before. 75 millimeters of steel plate went down across the top of her, and beneath it an armored hangar deck heavier than the deck of any carrier then afloat. A handful of navies had begun to armor their flight decks by then, the British foremost among them, but none had laid protection on this scale onto a hull this size. Most carriers of the war were thin-skinned things, quick and fragile. Their decks meant only to send aircraft into the air, never to stop a bomb. Shinano was built to take the hit and keep working. She carried protection all the way up to the deck her planes would fly from, because she was never meant to be an ordinary carrier at all. The idea behind her was stranger and grander than that. She was designed as a floating fortress, an armored forward base that could steam close to the fighting and live there, servicing and rearming other carriers under fire, handing them fuel and bombs and fresh aircraft, while the enemy tried and failed to sink her. A near unsinkable island of steel, wearing the armor of the largest battleships ever built, meant to keep a whole fleet in the fight. That armored deck is what made her extraordinary. And it is also, in the end, one of the cruelest ironies in her whole story. We are well past the middle of her build now, and from here, every choice made in this dock begins to point one direction. If you want to understand how a ship designed to be unsinkable ended up on the bottom of the sea on her very first night, stay with the build to the end. The armor, the haste, and the 17 hours are all bound together, and the rest of this dock is where that knot gets tied. Subscribe and keep watching. The payoff is worth the wait. Because for all the steel they were laying over her, there was one thing the constructors could neither draw nor armor against, and it was already working against them. Time. The plans were bold and the fortress on paper was magnificent. But a hull this size, rebuilt this completely, needed years the war was never going to give her. And the machinery that would have to drive this floating fortress out of the dock and into the sea was still at this moment sitting unfinished in the shops beneath her decks. The machinery beneath her decks was not new, and that is the first thing to understand about it. When the constructors turned a battleship into a carrier, they left her heart alone. The power plant that would drive Shinano was the one drawn for her as a battleship, unchanged. a battleship's engines carrying a carrier out to sea. It was an enormous plant. 4 steam turbines geared down to 4 separate shafts, each shaft running back to its own propeller. Campon turbines, the Navy's own design, built to move the heaviest hulls Japan had ever floated. At full power, they were rated for 150,000 shaft horsepower, enough to push a ship of her size to roughly 27 knots. On paper, she was fast, a fortress of that size that could still run with a fleet. But turbines are only half of a steam plant. Before a single shaft could turn, the steam had to be made, and steam was made in her boilers. Shinano was designed for 12 of them, 12 great boilers feeding the 4 turbines their pressure. And here the clock that had chased the ship from the day of her conversion order finally caught her. The yard ran out of time before it ran out of ship. Of the 12 boilers she was meant to carry, only 8 were ever finished. And of those 8, only 6 were lit when she finally put to sea. Do the arithmetic the way her engineers would have. Half her fires were cold. A warship built for 12 boilers went out into the Pacific, breathing through 6, driving 4 shafts on a fraction of the steam they were designed to swallow. She could not make her rated power. She could not make her rated speed. The fastest she would ever run, she ran under-fired and half-lit, hurried out of the yard with her own boiler shop still behind schedule in the spaces below. That is what haste does to a ship, and it does not always show on the outside. From the flight deck down to the waterline, she looked complete, a finished fortress of steel. But down in the fire rooms where it mattered most, she was a half-built engine wearing a finished hull. And still they moved her. The dock was needed, the war would not wait, and a ship this far along could not stay in the ground forever. Here is where Shinano parts from every battleship sister that came before her. Her 2 sisters had been launched. That word means something exact. A launch is a ship sliding down a slipway, built up on building ways that angle toward the water, then released to run stern first down the greased timbers and strike the sea in a wall of spray. That is how the great hulls had always gone into the water. It is a moment, a plunge, a thing crowds gather to watch. Shinano did none of that. She had never been built on ways. She had been built inside a graving dock, resting on rows of wooden keel blocks at the bottom of a stone basin. To put her in the water, there was no slide and no plunge. There was only the sea, let in. Over the first days of October 1944, the yard opened dry dock number 6 to the harbor and let the water climb. It rose around her hull foot by foot until it lifted her whole weight off the block she had rested on for 4 years, and for the first time she floated. Not launched, floated out. On the 8th of that month, she was given her name at last, Shinano, the largest warship that had ever been floated out of a dock rather than launched into the water. It should have been the proudest hour of the whole build. It was not clean. Something went wrong in the dock during the float out, an accident that marred the moment the yard had worked 4 years to reach. The record does not let us make it more than that, and it should not be dressed up into more. But the ship that came off those blocks was already a ship whose luck was running thin. And she was, in every way that would soon matter, unfinished. Floating her out was not the same as completing her. The hull was in the water, the boilers were half lit behind her, and a great deal of the work that keeps a warship alive had not yet been done at all. Getting her out of the dock was the easy part. What was left undone inside her in the weeks the Navy would not give her is where this story turns. She was commissioned on the 19th of November 1944. On paper, that word means a finished warship, accepted into the fleet, ready to fight. Shinano was none of those things. She was handed to the Navy while she was still, in every way that would soon matter, a building site. The doors were the worst of it. A warship survives a hit the way a hull is meant to, by being divided inside into a honeycomb of sealed compartments, so that water let into one cannot spread into the next. The watertight doors between those compartments are what hold the sea where it lands. On Shinano, many of those doors had never been installed. The frames for them stood empty. Holes cut through the bulkheads to pass pipe and cable had never been sealed. And the compartment air tests, the slow, methodical leak tests that fill a closed space with pressure and listen for where it escapes, so that every flooding path is found and shut before the ship ever meets deep water, had never been run. Not delayed. Never run at all. The systems built to fight flooding stood in the same half-made state. The fire mains and the bailing lines, the piping that carries water back out of a wounded hull, had been laid through the ship, but the pumps meant to drive them were not aboard. Pipes without pumps do not drain anything. On the day she was accepted into the fleet, Shinano could not have emptied a flooded compartment if her survival had depended on it. Within 10 days it would, her captain knew. Toshio Abe asked for more time. He asked to hold her at the yard long enough to finish the watertight work, to run the test, to hang the doors and fit the pumps that were still missing. He was refused. Time was the one thing the Navy would not give. The dock was needed for the next hull. American submarines were already working the home waters, and the order was to move her. So she was moved, unfinished, under a crew who had never taken her to sea. The damage control parties, the men whose whole purpose was to fight fire and flooding, had trained on a ship they had never sailed, over machinery that in many spaces was not yet there. And she did not go out with a fighting crew alone. Aboard her that first voyage were 2,175 officers and men, and with them about 300 shipyard workers and some 40 civilians, still finishing her as she steamed, still trying to close the ship around themselves while she ran. To let those workers reach the machinery spaces below, the watertight doors that had been fitted were left standing open. It is here that the story comes to a number this film will not give you. We have counted the dead in the yards that built other ships, because the records let us. For the workforce sealed behind the fence at Yokosuka, the men who raised this hull across 4 years under a roof, no camera was allowed past, no reliable count of the dead survives. The work was dangerous. Building on this scale always was, but there is no ledger we can trust, and we will not invent one to fill the silence. The human cost this story can prove is not in the dock. It is in the men who were still aboard her, sailors and shipwrights together, on the night she finally put to sea. She left Yokosuka on the evening of the 28th of November 1944 and steamed out into the dark. At about 3:15 the next morning, the 29th, the American submarine Archerfish found her. Her commander, Joseph Enright, fired 6 torpedoes. 4 of them struck Shinano along her starboard side. For a ship built the way she was built, 4 hits were enough. The sea came in through the torn plating and found exactly the paths no one had closed. It moved through the compartments the leak tests had never sealed, past the frames where the watertight doors had never been hung, through the openings left standing open for the yard workers. And where her armored belt met the underwater bulge meant to turn a torpedo aside, the joint itself had been poorly designed, so the water went deeper into her than it ever should have. The pumps that might have fought it, that were built to carry the flood back out, were not aboard. The armored deck above her, the heaviest ever fitted to a carrier, counted for nothing against water climbing from below. She took on a list, and the list did not stop. She rolled over and sank at 3 minutes before 11 that morning. Now hold the 2 clocks apart because they are not the same clock. From the moment the torpedo struck her to the moment she went under was less than 8 hours. From the moment she cast off her lines at Yokosuka to the moment the sea closed over her was roughly 17 hours. One first night at sea, 1,435 men died with her. 1,080 were pulled from the water alive. The records she left are the kind no Navy wants. She is still the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. 10 days from her commissioning to her loss gave her the shortest operational career of any capital ship of the entire war. And at up to about 73,000 tons, she was the heaviest aircraft carrier anyone had ever built. A record she held until the American supercarrier Forrestal took it from her in the 1950s, more than a decade after she was already on the bottom. Think back to where this began. A hull standing in the dark inside a roofed dock, screened from the sky, raised by men who lived behind a fence, a ship so completely hidden that no photograph of her building was ever officially taken. Every part of that effort worked. The machines could raise her, the dock could hold her, the secrecy held to the very end and past it. The one thing that failed was the plainest and the slowest, the unglamorous work of finishing her, the doors and the tests and the pumps that the clock took away before they were done. The haste that saved her hull from the scrappers and drove her out of the dock did not stay behind at the yard when she sailed. It went with her, and the way she was built is the way she died. The next time you come across her name, set it against what the name was covering. Not a great battle, not an enemy she ever fired a shot at. The largest warship in the world lost on her first night at sea to the one thing her builders were never given the time to finish.